Do you want to bring your D&D table to life? Well, why not make a custom DM screen? I built this one super cheap and easy for a Feywild one-shot. It is reversible and it's gonna come in super handy at my table. Hi, I'm Seb and I make stuff. And I also play D&D. We podcast our game over at Tomes and Tales RPG. And it's usually run by our Dungeon Master Cody. But I thought for once I'd give him a go at playing at the table rather than being stuck behind the screen. So in a few weeks, I'll be running a Feywild campaign set within our unique world of Niros. Usually when we play, Cody has a basic Dungeon Master screen set up like any other game you'd be used to seeing. But for this game, I want to really try and make this an explosion of Feywild life to really give this one-shot a bit of extra something. If you guys are interested in seeing how this plays out at the table, I'd love for you to follow us over at Tomes and Tales RPG. So, let's jump into the build, shall we? First things first, I'm gonna need to get a whole heap of foam board.
And so begins the cutting. I'm gonna chop this down to be about the right size to hide a DM screen behind if I want to keep all that information. And then I'm gonna grab some of this timber vinyl. I'm gonna be covering up my front wood planks with this to give us a nice natural wooden feel without a whole lot of work. So we're gonna cut these remaining pieces up and give ourselves 4 or 5 blocks of wood that will cover the front of our screen. I cut these all out individually because I want it to have more of a wooden plank feel than just one big piece of timber. So we're going to pull out that vinyl and cut it all down to size. I'm basically just going to measure this out by holding one of our pieces on top of the vinyl and cutting it away, then sticking them down. Once this is on the top, we cut out all the corners and start folding this over the edges to make sure that it all holds in place nicely. This doesn't have to be perfect as this is going to be glued down later on, but the more overlay you have, the better this will stick. I may have done them a little bit too narrow, but we are left with a nice looking piece of timber. Now to repeat this over the next 4 pieces. Now I'm going to cover the back with a different vinyl. This one is a bit more of a marble texture, just cutting it to size and covering the entire board. By having 2 different patterns, we should be able to spin this thing around in the end and give us 2 different styles of DM screens for different games. And now we're just going to glue down all of our timber pieces. I'm going to give the entire thing a decent coat in a wood glue, spreading that out to the very edges, and then coming in with a little bit of hot glue just to hold these pieces in place while the PVA has time to dry. I give that a good press down and leave it overnight with some weight to dry.
The next day.
Alright, so we've left this thing to dry and it's come out looking nice and timbery. We have a marble backing, so we'll be able to switch it around either direction to give us a couple of different options of a DM screen. But the main one we're going to be focusing on for this game is the timber front. So, this is our base. And this is going to become the stands on the side that keep it from falling over. My idea here is to cut these down to size and turn them into tree trunks. So we'll take this into the garage, chop them down, and see how we go from there. First things first, I need to mark these out. Minimum height. Minimum height. Let's go. Yeah, it's a little bit uneven, but that will work.
I made sure to cut from both ends so that I knew I'd have at least one flat base on each piece because I'm not the straightest cut.
Oh well, another slightly askew. Not quite even, but they'll do because they're both going to come up high enough and we want them to look like trees anyway, so they can have a little bit more randomness. So let's take these downstairs and work on the next part. So what we're going to try and do now is cut into these pipes and give ourselves maybe a 50-degree angle or something like that. Holy gee, okay. My whole table just fell down. There we go.
Now, where were we? Okay, so I used a little template that I made to mark out the equal distances on both of our pipes to try and keep these as close as possible, and then cut into it with a Japanese handsaw, leaving us with 2 roughly equal open sections on each pipe.
So now that we've cut those up, if we get out our DM screen, this is kind of the idea. These are going to sit on the corners as large trees, and they'll hold our main screen in the middle. So this is actually going to be a little bit bigger than the generic DM screen, but this is what we're sort of working with. Now to move on to the next stage.
For this, there's more cutting out of that foam board. I just cut a couple of strips roughly the right height, stuck them together with some masking tape, and then I used a little template of an angle that I made to make sure that both of them were roughly the same angle, and used some hot glue down the back of the spine to hold them in place. I repeated this over both pieces and had them fit nicely into the pipes, hot gluing these in place. There's almost nothing you can't do with some foam board and hot glue in this hobby. I then marked which way was down just so I didn't screw anything up, and pulled out some tin foil. With this, I made my base shape for the roots that are going to be coming out of the bottom of this tree to give it a more whimsical look, and just kept on gluing these in place till I was happy with the amount of extra shape. Once I was done with the roots, I gave them a heavy coat in hot glue to give them some more texture and a bit more stability, then started adding in some branches and knots further up the tree. Now we have a good basic shape. We're going to cut away any excess of that foam board that we had around the back just to get it nice and flush, and give the entire thing a heavy coat and bit of a pattern with hot glue. This isn't entirely necessary as I'm going to cover it all up, but you can do just this and give it a paint and you'll have a nice end result. We're going to repeat the entire process over the second branch and then come in with some foam clay. I'm going to coat the entire thing with this, spreading out a thin layer over the entire tree, making sure to really get it down into all the nooks and crannies and cover up all of the branches. Once I have a good level of coat over the entire thing, I'm going to grab out a popsicle stick and start running it down and pressing some patterns into the foam clay to give us a bit more of that wooden texture. And then repeating the process on our second tree. Now this got a night to dry, and then I took it outside for some spray paint. First things first was a grey primer. I coat pretty much every build in this stuff, and you guys are probably used to seeing it by now. After the grey primer, I came in with a new paint that I hadn't used before. This was a Rust-Oleum Camouflage Brown. I gave the entire thing a fairly heavy coat, and this actually gave me a really interesting texture in the end. It's probably not ideal for all situations, but in this case, it actually looked great as bark, giving me this awesome crackled texture. So to protect that, I gave the entire thing a fairly heavy coat in a matte clear coat, just so we don't break away any of those crackled textures. And then when this was dry, I came in with a NATO Brown model spray paint. This is a much nicer, natural looking brown in my opinion, and will suit our final build in a much nicer way. Once that was dry, I came in with my Towel Light Ochre from Citadel and gave the entire thing a fairly heavy dry brush. There are a few points that I hit it a little bit too heavy, but honestly, I think this came out looking pretty damn cool. So we repeat the process on our second piece, and we are left with two nice big trees.
And now these came out looking awesome. You could probably just use these as terrain by themselves, being large trees in a huge fantasy forest. But in my case, these are going to be used for the DM screen corners. So let's jump over and finish that build.
While I was making the tree, I came up with an idea to make some hinged edges for my DM screen. So I did some side pieces in the same way we did the main piece and grabbed some fake leather that I use for costuming. I cut this down to size and glued it in place, pinning it between the two layers of the DM screen. I wish I had done this on the original piece as well, but I thought about it too late, so I had to fix that later on. By gluing this in place and having them pin this together, I can glue this onto our main piece, and this will give us a nice hinged edge. So I made sure to line them up flat using a guide and glued the other side straight onto the back of our board. I didn't want this showing through, so I did grab a few pieces of thin cardboard and stuck them on top with that same marble pattern to attempt to hide the hinge and help pin it in place on both sides of the DM screen. If I was to do this again, I would just go directly between the two layers, but I didn't think about this till it was too late. So we weigh that down and let it dry overnight before coming in with a whole heap of moss and glue the following day to give us a bit more of a wild fey feeling. I'm using some of this loose moss as a first base layer, and then I come in over the entire thing with a whole heap of foam flocking to really fill in that base. Now we can fold that out on our table, throw in our trees to add a little bit more detail on those corners, and for something extra, we can put a few fake plants draping out of the top of those trees, add a little bit of something extra.
And with that, we have a completely custom DM screen. This turned out great on the table. You have the ability to remove these if you just want the plain wood. You can also flip the entire thing, and it's completely reversible, giving you multiple different angles. This played out beautifully at our table for a one-shot that I had, with everything really adding to the environment of the Feywild. The size of this is perfect to hide a general DM screen behind here if you want all of those reference rules, but still keeping an original front, not just those generic artworks that you see at most tables. Having something custom really does help bring the board to life, specifically if you've designed it to fit in with the game you're running. This was a really cheap and easy build. You could build a whole heap of different ones of these for different situations, or just do what I've done here and make it reversible so you've got a couple of different options. But ultimately I am left with an awesome custom DM screen that I'm going to be using for most of my games going forward. And for some more of the custom builds that I made for this Feywild one-shot, jump over to this video here where you can see how we made these awesome floating islands. Until next time, never stop making stuff.